My son's teacher told him she'd be a better parent than me. I taught her a lesson she will never forget. My 6-year-old son, Oliver, started first grade so excited about his new teacher, Miss Whitman. She was young, maybe 25, always smiling, and Oliver said she was the nicest teacher in the whole school. He'd come home talking about how she read stories with special voices and let them have extra snack time on Fridays. I was thrilled he loved school so much after a rough kindergarten year with a strict teacher who made him cry. The first month was perfect. Oliver bouncing out of bed ready for school, homework done without fighting, constant stories about what Miss Whitman said or did. Then little things started seeming off. Oliver mentioned that Miss Whitman said his lunch wasn't healthy enough, and she'd started bringing him special lunches she made at home. When I asked about this at pickup, she said Oliver seemed hungry, and she wanted to help. I explained we were fine financially, and his lunch was perfectly nutritious. She laughed and said she just cared so much about her students. Next, Oliver came home saying Miss Whitman didn't like his haircut that I'd just given him. She said it made him look messy, and offered to take him to her salon on Saturday to fix it. I emailed immediately saying that wasn't appropriate. She responded that she was just trying to help since I seemed overwhelmed as a single dad. I wasn't overwhelmed. My wife had passed 2 years ago, but Oliver and I were doing great. The comments got weirder. Oliver said Miss Whitman told the class that some mommies weren't good at taking care of their kids, so teachers had to help. When another kid said their mommy was the best, Miss Whitman said sometimes kids didn't know what good care looked like. Oliver was confused because he didn't have a mommy anymore, but Miss Whitman kept talking about how mommies needed to do better. At parent-teacher conferences, she spent the whole time asking about our home life. Did Oliver have proper bedtimes? Did I read to him enough? Did he eat vegetables? When I said everything was fine, she said kids with only one parent often fell behind without proper support. She offered to tutor Oliver after school for free at her apartment. I declined firmly, and she said I was being prideful instead of thinking about Oliver's needs. Halloween came and Oliver wanted to be a dinosaur. I spent hours making his costume with him, cardboard scales and painted claws. He loved it. He wore it to school for their parade and came home in tears. Miss Whitman had told him it looked homemade in a bad way and gave him a store-bought prince costume she just happened to have in his size. Said princes were better than dinosaurs, and his real costume was embarrassing. That night, Oliver asked if Miss Whitman could be his new mommy, since she knew what kids needed better than I did. My blood went cold. I asked what he meant, and he said Miss Whitman told him she would be a better mommy than anyone, and someday she'd take care of him properly. She'd been telling him this for weeks during their special lunch times, that she loved him more than anyone else could and wanted to be his mommy. I called the principal immediately, but it was after hours. Next morning, I was at school before the doors opened. The principal, Mrs. Foster, tried to brush it off as a young teacher being enthusiastic. I demanded she investigate. She said she'd look into it, but Miss Whitman was beloved and probably just meant she cared about her students like family. I knew that wasn't enough, so I started talking to other parents at pickup. Turns out Oliver wasn't the only one. 3 other single parents had similar stories. Kids coming home saying Miss Whitman would be a better parent. Extra attention for kids from divorced families, telling kids their parents didn't pack good lunches or dress them right. One mom said her daughter asked if Miss Whitman could adopt her because she said she wanted to. We went to the principal as a group. Mrs. Foster finally took it seriously and said she'd observe the class. But Oliver came home that day saying Miss Whitman had told him not to tell anyone about their special talks anymore because some people wouldn't understand how much she loved him. That was it. I pulled Oliver out of school for the rest of the week and contacted the district superintendent with every incident documented. The other parents did the same. The superintendent launched an investigation immediately, and what they found out changed everything. The superintendent's investigation dug through Miss Whitman's employment history and found records from her previous district that made my stomach turn. She had worked at another elementary school 2 years ago, where she formed an unhealthy attachment to a 3rd-grade boy whose mother had died of cancer. The boy's father complained after Miss Whitman started showing up at their house unannounced with gifts and offering to babysit on weekends. School administrators documented multiple conversations where they told her to maintain professional boundaries, but she kept pushing. Eventually, they gave her the choice to resign quietly or face formal disciplinary action. She resigned. They wrote a neutral reference letter that said nothing about the boundary violations, and she moved to our district where nobody knew about her pattern of targeting grieving families. The hiring manager never called the previous principal directly, just relied on the sanitized paperwork, and Miss Whitman walked right into another classroom full of vulnerable kids. Owen Grimes called my cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. His voice sounded tired and angry at the same time as he apologized for the system failing Oliver and the other children. He explained that Miss Whitman was on immediate administrative leave starting that morning and wouldn't be allowed back in the building during the investigation. Then he asked if I would consent to having Oliver evaluated by the district's child psychologist to document any emotional impact from what happened. I agreed without hesitation because I needed to understand what my son had been through and whether the confusion I saw in him was normal or something deeper. Owen said he'd have the psychologist's office contact me to schedule an appointment and thanked me for my patience with the process. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the work parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to process the fact that this could have been prevented if someone at her old school had been honest about why she really left. That evening, I sat Oliver down on the couch in our living room and tried to find words that would make sense to a 6-year-old. I told him Miss Whitman wouldn't be his teacher anymore because she made some mistakes about what teachers should say to students. His face crumpled immediately, and tears started running down his cheeks as he asked if he did something wrong. My heart felt like it was breaking as I pulled him onto my lap and spent the next hour reassuring him that he was perfect, and this had nothing to do with anything he said or did. I explained that grown-ups have rules about how to act with kids, and Miss Whitman broke those rules, which meant she couldn't be a teacher right now. Oliver kept asking if she was mad at him or if he could visit her to say sorry, and I had to keep redirecting him back to the truth that he hadn't done anything wrong. By the time he finally calmed down, his shirt was soaked with tears, and I felt exhausted from trying to protect him from understanding the full ugliness of what an adult he trusted had done to him. 3 days later, I drove Oliver to the district office for his appointment with Kirsten Weaver, the child psychologist. The waiting room had toys and books scattered around to make it less scary, but Oliver clung to my hand and refused to look at anyone. Kirsten came out to meet us with a warm smile and gentle voice that immediately put me a little more at ease. She was probably in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm way of moving that suggested she'd done this many times before. She explained to Oliver that they were going to play some games and talk about school, and she told me I could watch through a one-way mirror in the observation room next door. I followed a staff member to the small room and watched through the glass as Kirsten sat on the floor with Oliver and pulled out bins of toys. She started with simple play, letting him choose what to do, asking casual questions about his favorite things. Gradually, she steered the conversation toward school and teachers, using puppets to act out scenarios about what teachers should and shouldn't say to students. Oliver opened up slowly, moving toy figures around as he talked about how Miss Whitman said special things to him during lunch that made him feel confused. I watched my son try to make sense of why his favorite teacher told him she wanted to be his mommy and whether that meant something was wrong with our family. Kirsten never pushed, just followed his lead and helped him express feelings he didn't have words for yet. After the session ended and Oliver went back to the waiting room with a staff member, Kirsten brought me into her office to discuss what she observed. She sat across from me with a notepad and explained that Oliver showed clear signs of emotional manipulation and confusion about adult boundaries. The way Miss Whitman had positioned herself as a maternal figure while undermining my role as his father had left him uncertain about who to trust and what appropriate care looked like. Kirsten said the good news was we caught it early enough that therapy could help him rebuild a healthy understanding of teacher-student relationships before the damage became permanent. She recommended weekly sessions for at least 3 months, possibly longer depending on how he progressed. Then she warned me to prepare for Oliver to have trust issues with authority figures for a while, especially teachers, because his sense of safety in the school had been violated by someone he admired. I asked if he would be okay long-term, and she said yes, with proper support, but emphasized that I needed to be patient with behavioral regression and emotional outbursts as he processed what happened. Catherine Haynes called me that night around 9 after Oliver had gone to bed. Her voice shook as she said she couldn't stop thinking about all the warning signs she missed with her daughter Sophie. We ended up talking for 2 hours, both of us sitting in our separate houses in the dark, processing our guilt over not recognizing sooner what Miss Whitman was doing. Catherine told me Sophie had been coming home for weeks, saying Miss Whitman explained that divorce meant her parents didn't love her enough to stay together. Catherine had thought it was just a child's misunderstanding of adult conversations, maybe something Sophie overheard from other kids, until the investigation revealed that Miss Whitman had been telling multiple children from divorced families that their parents failed them. We talked about how convincing Miss Whitman had been, how she framed everything as caring and helpful, how she made us feel grateful for her attention to our kids instead of suspicious. By the end of the call, we both felt a little less alone in our anger and confusion, and we promised to keep checking in with each other as our families navigated whatever came next. The school assigned a substitute teacher to Oliver's class while they searched for a permanent replacement for Miss Whitman. I got the email from Mrs. Foster on Thursday evening explaining the transition plan and asking for patience during this difficult time. Friday morning, Oliver woke up and refused to get dressed for school, saying he didn't want a new teacher who wouldn't like him. Saturday and Sunday, he seemed okay, distracted by weekend activities, but Monday morning brought a complete meltdown when I tried to get him ready. He screamed that he didn't want to go, that the new teacher would be mean, that he wanted Miss Whitman back. Tuesday was worse, with Oliver hiding under his bed and crying so hard he made himself sick. Wednesday, I gave up and called my boss to explain I needed to take emergency family leave for the rest of the week. I stayed home with Oliver, trying to help him feel safe again, but every mention of school triggered panic and tears. The following Monday, I tried a different approach. I told Oliver I would walk him all the way to his classroom, and we would meet the substitute teacher together before I left. He agreed reluctantly, clinging to my hand as we walked through the school hallway. The substitute was a woman probably in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She introduced herself simply as Mrs. Bradley and shook Oliver's hand with a gentle firmness that didn't demand anything from him. I explained quietly that Oliver was nervous about new teachers, and she nodded with understanding in her eyes that told me Mrs. Foster had briefed her on the situation. Mrs. Bradley told Oliver he could sit wherever he felt comfortable and that she wouldn't call on him unless he raised his hand first. She didn't try to hug him or make grand promises about being the best teacher ever. She just gave him space to warm up to her gradually, treating him like any other student instead of someone special who needed extra attention. Oliver looked up at me with scared eyes, and I squeezed his hand before letting go, promising I would be right there at pickup time. 2 weeks after Miss Whitman's administrative leave started, a district investigator contacted me to schedule a formal interview. She arrived at my house on a Saturday morning with a briefcase full of documents and a digital recorder. We sat at my kitchen table while Oliver played in his room, and she asked me to walk through every incident I could remember involving Miss Whitman's behavior. I started with the lunch comments and worked my way through months of interactions, realizing as I talked how many small things I had dismissed as enthusiastic teaching. The investigator took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions that made me see patterns I hadn't recognized before. The way Miss Whitman had tested boundaries with small violations before escalating to bigger ones. How she specifically targeted moments when Oliver was vulnerable or missing his mother. The calculated steps she took to position herself as irreplaceable in his life while undermining my role as his parent. The investigator's face remained professionally neutral, but I could see her pen pressing harder into the paper as I described how Miss Whitman told Oliver she would be a better mother than anyone. By the end of 2 hours, my throat was raw from talking, and I felt drained from reliving every moment. The investigator interviewed Madeline Fraser the same day, and Madeline called me that evening to share what came up during her session. Her voice trembled with anger as she described how her son had started calling Miss Whitman Mommy at the school during the weeks before the complaints started. When Madeline found out and corrected him, saying Miss Whitman was his teacher, not his mother, her son came home confused because Miss Whitman had told him it was okay to call her that. She said she loved him like a mother would, and that some children needed extra mothers because their real ones were too busy with divorce stuff to give them enough attention. The investigator's face had gone pale when Madeline described this, and she made extensive notes about the severity of the boundary violations. Madeline said the investigator asked detailed questions about whether Miss Whitman had ever tried to arrange time alone with her son outside of school. And Madeline remembered that Miss Whitman had offered twice to take him to the park on weekends, so Madeline could have a break. At the time, it seemed generous, but now it felt predatory, like Miss Whitman was actively trying to insert herself into their family structure and replace Madeline as the primary maternal figure in her son's life. I got a call from Catherine 2 weeks after the investigation started. Her voice was tight with anger as she told me that Miss Whitman had been reaching out to parents who weren't part of our complaint group, asking them to write letters saying what a wonderful teacher she was. Catherine had heard this from another mom at pickup who seemed confused about why anyone would complain about Miss Whitman. The woman said Miss Whitman told her that some parents were trying to destroy her career because they were jealous of how much the kids loved her. I felt sick hearing this. Miss Whitman was spinning the story to make us look like the bad guys. Catherine said 3 other parents had mentioned similar conversations, and some of them seemed to believe Miss Whitman's version of events. They thought we were overreacting and going after a good teacher who just cared too much. I called Owen immediately and explained what was happening. He sounded frustrated but not surprised. He said he would have the district lawyer send a cease and desist letter telling Miss Whitman to stop contacting anyone connected to the case. But the damage was already done. Some parents at the school were giving us cold looks at pickup now, whispering when we walked by. One dad even said to Vicky that she should think about what she was doing to Miss Whitman's life. The whole thing made me furious, but also scared that maybe the investigation wouldn't be enough if people thought we were lying. Oliver's first therapy session with Kirsten happened on a Thursday afternoon. I sat in the waiting room flipping through magazines without reading them while she talked to him in her office. The session lasted an hour, and when the door opened, Oliver walked out looking confused and a little sad. Kirsten smiled at him and told him he did a great job, then asked if she could talk to me alone for a few minutes. Oliver sat in the waiting room with a puzzle while Kirsten and I went back into her office. She said Oliver had talked about Miss Whitman a lot, describing the special lunches and the things she said about being his mommy. Then Kirsten told me that at the end of the session, Oliver had asked her a question that broke my heart. He wanted to know if it was okay that he still missed Miss Whitman, even though she did bad things. I felt tears sting my eyes as Kirsten explained that this was a normal response for a child who had been manipulated by someone they trusted. When I picked Oliver up and we got in the car, he asked me the same question. I pulled over in the parking lot so I could look at him while I answered. I told him that feelings were complicated, and it was completely normal to miss someone even when they hurt you. I explained that Miss Whitman had said and done things that weren't okay, but that didn't mean all the fun times they had together were fake. I said that grown-ups are responsible for making good choices even when kids don't understand why things are wrong, and Miss Whitman had made bad choices that weren't his fault. He nodded slowly and asked if he would get in trouble for missing her. I promised him he would never get in trouble for his feelings, only for his actions, and that it was okay to feel confused about all of this. Owen called me a week later to tell me the school board had scheduled a closed hearing to review the investigation findings. He said I could submit a written statement if I wanted, or I could attend the hearing and speak directly to the board. He explained that the hearing would include the investigator's report, statements from affected families, and Miss Whitman's response through her lawyer. I asked if I had to attend, and he said no, but he thought it might help the board understand the real impact on our children if they heard from us directly. I told him I would be there. I needed to look those board members in the eyes and make them understand what Miss Whitman had done to Oliver. After I hung up, I called Catherine to let her know about the hearing. She said she was planning to attend too, and we should all meet beforehand to prepare our statements together. She suggested a coffee shop near the district office, and I agreed. Madeline and Vicky both said they would come too when Catherine reached out to them. We needed to support each other through this because none of us had ever done anything like this before. The four of us met at the coffee shop 3 days before the hearing. We sat at a corner table with our drinks getting cold while we talked about what we wanted to say to the board. Catherine looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes that matched mine. Madeline kept rubbing her temples like she had a headache that wouldn't go away. Vicky was quieter than usual, just listening and nodding as we talked. We were all dealing with our kids' emotional fallout at home while trying to manage our own anger and guilt about not seeing the warning signs sooner. Catherine said her daughter was having nightmares again and asking why Miss Whitman didn't love her anymore. Madeline's son had started acting out at the school with the substitute teacher, refusing to follow directions because he said she wasn't as nice as Miss Whitman. Vicky's daughter kept asking when Miss Whitman was coming back. We were all exhausted from explaining the same things over and over to our confused kids, while dealing with the judgment from other parents who thought we were overreacting. I told them about the cold looks at pickup and the dad who confronted Vicky. We all agreed that no matter what happened at the hearing, we had done the right thing by speaking up. Before we left, Catherine reached across the table and grabbed my hand. She said we needed to make a pact to support each other through whatever came next, whether the board sided with us or not. We all put our hands together in the middle of the table like kids making a promise, and it felt good to know I wasn't facing this alone. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with Miss Whitman. The lunch comments, the haircut criticism, the Halloween costume incident. How had I missed the pattern? How had I not seen that she was systematically trying to replace me in Oliver's life? I kept thinking about all the times I'd dismissed my gut feeling that something was off because she seemed so enthusiastic and caring. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went to my kitchen table. I pulled out a notebook and started writing down every single incident I could remember. Every comment Miss Whitman made about Oliver's lunch or clothes or haircut. Every time she offered to take him somewhere alone. Every conversation where she questioned my parenting or suggested I was overwhelmed. I wrote down exact dates when I could remember them and approximate timelines when I couldn't. I included what Oliver told me about their special lunchtimes and the things she said about being his mommy. I wrote about the Halloween costume and how Oliver came home crying, asking if Miss Whitman could be his new mom. The more I wrote, the clearer the pattern became. She had tested boundaries with small violations first, then escalated when I didn't push back hard enough. She had targeted Oliver's grief over losing his mother and positioned herself as the solution to his pain. By the time the sun came up, I had 10 pages of documentation. My hand was cramping from writing and my eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I felt more prepared to face the board than I had before. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the district office. I arrived early with my 10 pages of notes clutched in my hand. Catherine, Madeline, and Vicky were already in the waiting area outside the boardroom, all of them looking as nervous as I felt. Owen came out to greet us and explain how the hearing would work. The board would hear from the investigator first, then from us if we wanted to speak, then from Miss Whitman's lawyer. After that, they would deliberate in private and make their decision. He warned us that Miss Whitman's lawyer might try to paint us as overprotective parents who misunderstood normal teacher enthusiasm. We needed to stay calm and stick to the facts. At exactly 10 o'clock, a board member opened the door and invited us in. The room was smaller than I expected, with a long table where 5 board members sat with serious expressions. The investigator was already there with a thick folder of documents. Miss Whitman's lawyer sat on the opposite side of the room, a middle-aged woman in a gray suit who didn't look at us when we walked in. Owen gestured for us to sit in chairs along the wall, and the hearing began. The investigator presented her findings first, walking through the timeline of complaints and the evidence she had gathered. She described Miss Whitman's previous reprimand at another district and the pattern of boundary violations with students from single-parent homes. When she finished, the board chair asked if any of the affected parents wanted to speak. I stood up with my pages of notes and walked to the front of the room. I spoke for 15 minutes about how Miss Whitman had systematically targeted Oliver's grief over losing his mother. I described the lunch replacements and how she positioned them as caring for him better than I could. I explained the haircut comments and the offer to take him to her salon, implying I couldn't properly groom my own son. I talked about the Halloween costume incident and how she replaced Oliver's homemade dinosaur costume with a store-bought prince costume, making him feel ashamed of what we created together. My voice cracked when I described Oliver asking if Miss Whitman could be his new mommy because she told him she would be better at taking care of him than anyone else. I looked directly at each board member as I explained how she had told my 6-year-old son that she loved him more than anyone else could and wanted to be his mother. 2 of the board members had tears in their eyes by the time I finished. I could see Owen's jaw clenching as he listened, and the superintendent was writing notes furiously. When I sat back down, my hands were shaking, but I felt like I had finally made someone in authority understand the full scope of what happened to my son. Catherine spoke next, and her voice was steady but angry as she described what happened to Sophie. She explained how Miss Whitman had told Sophie that divorce meant her parents didn't love her enough to stay together, how she emphasized over and over that Sophie's family was broken and sad because of the divorce. Catherine's voice got louder as she described how Sophie started having nightmares about her parents dying because Miss Whitman kept talking about how terrible it was for children when families fell apart. Sophie had asked Catherine if she and her ex-husband were going to die like Oliver's mom did, because Miss Whitman said that's what happened to families that weren't whole. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Catherine spoke. One of them, an older man with glasses, interrupted to ask the investigator a pointed question about why the previous district's concerns weren't caught during the hiring process. The investigator admitted that the reference check had failed because Miss Whitman's previous district gave her a neutral reference to avoid legal complications. They hadn't flagged the reprimand or explained why she left. The board member looked furious and made a note on his papers. Madeline and Vicky spoke after Catherine, adding their own stories of boundary violations and inappropriate comments. By the time we finished, the board members looked shell-shocked. The board chair announced they would deliberate in private and asked us to wait in the hallway. We filed out of the room and the door closed behind us with a heavy click. The investigator and Owen stayed inside for the deliberations. We sat on hard plastic chairs in the hallway and waited. Madeline started pacing after the first 30 minutes, walking back and forth in front of the water fountain. Vicky sat with her head in her hands, not saying anything. Catherine and I tried to make small talk, but kept trailing off into silence. We could hear muffled voices through the door, but couldn't make out any words. An hour passed, then 2 hours. I started to worry that they were struggling to reach a decision, that maybe Miss Whitman's lawyer had convinced them we were overreacting. After 3 hours, I was ready to scream from the tension. Catherine kept checking her phone, and Madeline had worn a path in the floor from her pacing. Vicky looked like she might be sick. I tried to stay calm by reminding myself that we had done everything we could. We had documented everything, spoken clearly about the impact, and now it was up to the system to do its job. But the waiting was torture. The door finally opened and Owen stepped out into the hallway. His face was serious, but I couldn't read his expression. We all stood up immediately, holding our breath. Owen looked at each of us and then said the board had voted unanimously to terminate Miss Whitman's employment effective immediately. Relief hit me so hard I had to grab the back of a chair to stay standing. Owen continued explaining that the board was also reporting her conduct to the State Teaching Certification Board with a recommendation that her license be suspended or revoked. He apologized again for the system's failures, for not catching the red flags during hiring, for Mrs. Foster's initial dismissal of our concerns. He promised that the district would conduct a full review of hiring procedures and teacher supervision protocols to prevent this from happening to other families. Catherine started crying, and Madeline hugged her. Vicky let out a long breath like she had been holding it for months. I felt tears on my own face, but I was too tired to wipe them away. Owen shook my hand and thanked us for being brave enough to speak up. He said our children were lucky to have parents who fought for them. I couldn't speak, just nodded and tried to process that it was actually over. We walked out of the district office into the bright afternoon sunlight. The parking lot was half empty, and I could hear birds singing in the trees nearby. It felt surreal after the intensity of the hearing room. Catherine grabbed me in a tight hug right there in the parking lot, not caring who saw us. She said she couldn't have gotten through this without our group support, that knowing other families were going through the same thing made her feel less crazy. I hugged her back and told her the same thing. Madeline and Vicky joined the hug, and we stood there in a circle for a minute. 4 parents who had been strangers 2 months ago, but were now bonded by the worst experience of our parenting lives. When we finally let go, I looked at each of them and realized that finding these other families had been the one good thing to come out of this nightmare. We had protected our children together, and that mattered more than anything Miss Whitman had tried to destroy. I drove home from the district office feeling like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in weeks. Oliver was at my parents' house for the afternoon, and I needed to pick him up soon. but I sat in my car for a few minutes just processing what had happened. Miss Whitman was gone. Really gone. The board had terminated her employment and reported her to the state, and there was no going back from that. I started the engine and headed to my parents' place, rehearsing in my head how I would explain this to Oliver in a way that wouldn't make him feel responsible or scared about what came next. When I got there, he was playing in the backyard with my dad, kicking a soccer ball back and forth. He looked so normal, so happy in that moment, and I hated that I had to bring up Miss Whitman again. But he needed to know what happened. We drove home and I made him a snack, then sat down with him at the kitchen table. I explained that Miss Whitman wouldn't be his teacher anymore because she had broken some important rules that teachers have to follow. Oliver's face crumpled and he asked if she was in trouble because of him. My chest tightened at the question because I knew he'd been carrying this fear around. I told him no, that teachers have rules they must follow, and Miss Whitman broke those rules all by herself. He nodded slowly, seeming to accept this, but then he asked if his new permanent teacher would leave too. The question hit me hard because it showed how deeply this whole situation had shaken his sense of security. I pulled him close and promised that his new teacher would be someone who knew how to follow the rules and would stay with his class for the whole year. He leaned against me and asked what his new teacher would be like, and I had to admit I didn't know yet because the school was still finding someone good. The next few days passed in a strange calm. Oliver went back to the school with the substitute teacher and seemed to settle into a routine, though he was quieter than usual. I checked in with him every evening about how school went, and he'd give me short answers about what they learned or who he played with at recess, but he didn't talk about the substitute teacher much. Then on Friday afternoon, Mrs. Foster called me. She said the district had hired a new permanent teacher for Oliver's class and asked if I could come in Monday morning before school started to meet her. The teacher's name was Orla Hayes, and she had 15 years of experience teaching first grade, plus special training in working with kids who'd been through difficult situations. I felt relief wash over me at hearing this, because it sounded like the district was taking Oliver's needs seriously. I agreed to come in Monday and asked if Orla would be meeting with all the affected families, and Mrs. Foster said yes, she'd be meeting with each of us individually before taking over the class. Monday morning, I dropped Oliver at my parents' house again and drove to the school. Mrs. Foster met me in the main office and walked me to an empty classroom where Orla was waiting. She was maybe 40, with short dark hair and a calm way of standing that immediately made me feel less anxious. We shook hands and sat down at a table meant for 6-year-olds, our knees bumping the underside. Orla started by saying she'd been briefed on what happened with Miss Whitman and wanted to hear directly from me about Oliver's experience and what he needed going forward. I spent 20 minutes telling her everything, from the special lunches to the Halloween costume to Oliver asking if Miss Whitman could be his new mommy. Orla listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, and when I finished, she looked at me with understanding in her eyes. She said rebuilding Oliver's trust in teachers would take time and patience, which she was prepared to provide. She explained her approach of maintaining consistent, appropriate boundaries while still being warm and supportive, and asked me to let her know immediately if Oliver showed any signs of anxiety or confusion about her behavior. I left that meeting feeling like Oliver was finally going to be in good hands. The next day, Orla met with Catherine, then Madeline, then Vicky, spending an hour with each family to understand what their kids had been through. Catherine texted me afterward saying Orla seemed perfect for the situation, and I agreed. Wednesday was Oliver's first day with Orla as his permanent teacher. I walked him to class that morning, more nervous than he seemed to be. Orla greeted us at the classroom door with a friendly smile and introduced herself to Oliver. She told him she was excited to be his teacher and was looking forward to learning with the whole class. Oliver gave her a shy smile and went to his desk without looking back at me. I stood in the hallway for a minute, watching through the door window as Orla started the morning routine, and then I forced myself to leave and trust that this would be okay. That afternoon at pickup, Oliver came out of school with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. I asked how his day went, and he said it was good. I asked about Orla, and he thought for a moment, then said she was nice, but not in the same way Miss Whitman was. Something about the way he said it made me realize he was starting to understand the difference between appropriate teacher kindness and the manipulative attention Miss Whitman had given him. I asked what he meant, and he said Orla was nice to everyone the same way. Not special nice, just to him. I told him that was exactly how teachers should be, and he nodded like this made sense. 2 weeks later, I had a parent consultation with Kirsten Weaver, the child psychologist who'd been working with Oliver. She told me he was making good progress in therapy, but still struggled with understanding why an adult he trusted would say confusing things about his family. Kirsten recommended I continue reinforcing that Miss Whitman's behavior was about her own problems, not anything wrong with Oliver or our family. She said kids Oliver's age have trouble understanding that adults can make bad choices, and he needed repeated reassurance that he didn't cause any of this. I promised to keep having those conversations with him and asked how long she thought therapy would need to continue. Kirsten said probably another 2 months at least, maybe longer depending on how Oliver adjusted to having Orla as his permanent teacher. Around the same time, I got a call from an investigator with the State Teaching Certification Board. She said they'd opened their own investigation into Miss Whitman's conduct based on the district's report and needed my statement. I spent an hour on the phone with her, going through every incident again, and she explained that if they found serious misconduct, they could revoke or suspend Miss Whitman's teaching license. This would prevent her from teaching in any school in the state, maybe even other states if those certification boards honored the decision. I asked how long the investigation would take, and she said probably 3 to 4 months because they had to interview multiple witnesses and review all the documentation. I hung up feeling glad that the state was taking this seriously, but frustrated that it would take so long. That evening, Catherine called me, her voice tight with anger. She said she'd been looking at Miss Whitman's social media and found posts about being persecuted for caring too much about her students. Miss Whitman hadn't named anyone specifically, but she was clearly talking about our complaints and painting herself as a dedicated teacher being punished for going above and beyond. Some of her friends and former students' parents were commenting in support, saying she was the best teacher their kids ever had and that we were overreacting. I felt my blood pressure spike reading the posts Catherine forwarded to me. I wanted to respond, to tell everyone what Miss Whitman had really done, but our lawyer had advised us to avoid any direct or indirect contact with her. Catherine and I vented to each other for half an hour about how unfair it was that Miss Whitman got to control the narrative on social media while we had to stay silent. But eventually we agreed that engaging would only make things worse. 3 weeks into working with Orla, Oliver had a setback. He came home from the school looking anxious and asked if we could talk. We sat on the couch and he pulled a small sticker out of his backpack, a golden star with smiley face on it. Orla had given it to him for good work on a math worksheet. Oliver asked if this meant Orla was going to start bringing him special things like Miss Whitman did. My heart sank because I realized how deeply the boundary violations had affected his understanding of normal teacher-student interactions. I explained that teachers sometimes give all students small rewards like stickers for good work, and that was different from bringing special lunches or costumes just for one student. Oliver seemed uncertain, so I told him we could talk to Orla about it if it made him uncomfortable. He said he liked the sticker, but it made him worried, and I said that was a completely normal feeling to have. That evening, I emailed Orla explaining what happened and asking if she could adjust her approach with Oliver to keep rewards class-wide rather than individual for now. She responded within an hour saying she completely understood the problem and would make sure to only give out rewards to the whole class going forward. She thanked me for helping her understand Oliver's specific triggers so she could avoid accidentally creating situations that reminded him of Miss Whitman. I felt grateful that Orla was so receptive and willing to adapt her teaching style for Oliver's needs. The following week, the district sent out a statement to all parents explaining that a teacher had been terminated for professional misconduct and that new policies were being implemented to prevent similar situations. They didn't name Miss Whitman, but everyone in the school community knew who they were talking about. At pickup that afternoon, several parents I barely knew gave me sympathetic looks, and one mom touched my arm and said she was sorry we'd gone through this. I appreciated the support, but also felt exposed, like everyone was watching me and Oliver to see how damaged we were. A week after that awkward scene at pickup, Catherine called and asked if Oliver wanted to come over for a playdate with her daughter Sophie. I said yes without thinking twice because Oliver needed to spend time with other kids who understood what he'd been through, even if they were too young to really talk about it. We drove to Catherine's house on Saturday morning, and Oliver ran straight to Sophie's room where she had her toys spread across the floor. I watched them through the doorway as they built a tower together with blocks, laughing when it fell over, starting again without any frustration. They looked like normal 6-year-olds having fun, not kids who'd been manipulated by an adult they trusted. Catherine and I sat in her kitchen drinking coffee while keeping one eye on the playroom. She told me it amazed her how fast kids bounced back from things that would mess up adults for years. I agreed, but said I still worried about the long-term effects we couldn't see yet. Catherine nodded and admitted she had the same fear, that Sophie would grow up with trust issues or problems with authority figures. We sat there for a while just watching our kids play, both of us dealing with the guilt of not protecting them better while also trying to accept that we'd done the best we could with the information we had. The next therapy session with Kirsten brought good news for once. She pulled me aside after working with Oliver and explained that he was making real progress in how he thought about what happened. Oliver could now say that parts of being in class with Miss Whitman were fun and nice, like the special voices during story time or the extra snacks on Fridays, while also understanding that the things she said about being his mommy and taking care of him were wrong. Kirsten said this ability to hold 2 different feelings at once was a big step for a 6-year-old. Most kids his age saw things as all good or all bad, but Oliver was learning that people could do some things right and other things very wrong. She told me this meant he was processing the experience in a healthy way instead of just burying it or getting confused about who to trust. I felt relief wash over me because I'd been so scared that Miss Whitman had damaged something in Oliver that we couldn't fix. 2 days later, I got home from work and found a thick envelope in the mailbox with a law firm's return address I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Inside was a letter from Miss Whitman's lawyer threatening to sue me, Catherine, Madeline, and Vicky for defamation and conspiracy to destroy her career. The letter said we'd made false accusations that cost her job and reputation, and unless we issued public apologies and paid damages, they'd file a lawsuit seeking hundreds of thousands of dollars. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the pages. I called Catherine right away, and she said she'd gotten the same letter. Her voice was tight with anger, but she reminded me that her lawyer had warned us this might happen. She said people who got caught doing wrong things often tried to scare their accusers into silence. I knew she was right, but seeing those legal threats in writing made everything feel real and dangerous in a new way. Catherine, Madeline, Vicky, and I met at a coffee shop that evening to figure out what to do. None of us had money for a big legal fight, and the idea of being sued terrified all of us. Madeline suggested we pool our money and hire a lawyer together instead of each getting our own. We called around and found an attorney who handled education law cases and agreed to meet with us as a group. His name was Robert Adler, and his office was in the next town over. We drove there together 2 days later, all four of us crammed into Catherine's car, passing around the threatening letters and trying not to panic. Robert read through everything carefully, asked us detailed questions about what we'd reported and what evidence we had, and then leaned back in his chair. He told us that our complaints were made in good faith with real evidence to back them up, which protected us from defamation claims. He explained that truth was a complete defense against defamation, and everything we'd reported had been proven true by the district's investigation. Robert said Miss Whitman's lawyer was probably just trying to scare us into staying quiet, and that actually filing a lawsuit would force Miss Whitman to defend her actions in public court, where all the evidence would come out. He didn't think they'd actually follow through with the threat. Robert drafted a response letter laying out all the documented evidence of Miss Whitman's misconduct. He listed every incident we'd reported, every witness statement, every finding from the district investigation. His letter made it clear that any lawsuit would require Miss Whitman to explain in open court why she told students she wanted to be their mommy, why she brought them special lunches and costumes, why she said their parents weren't good enough. Robert sent the letter and we waited. Days went by with no response. Then a week passed. Then 2 weeks. The threat of legal action just disappeared like it had never existed. Robert called to tell us he didn't expect to hear anything back, that the other lawyer had probably advised Miss Whitman that a lawsuit would only make things worse for her. I felt the tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders finally start to ease. Oliver's therapy sessions shifted focus after that. Kirsten started working with him on understanding what healthy relationships with adults should look like. She used examples from his life, asking him how I showed him I cared versus how Miss Whitman had done it. Oliver said I made him breakfast and helped with homework and took him to the park. Kirsten asked if I ever told him I loved him more than anyone else could, or said I should be the only person taking care of him. Oliver shook his head no. She brought up his grandparents and asked how they showed love. Oliver talked about how they took him to movies and taught him to ride his bike and called every week to check on him. Kirsten asked if they ever said his dad wasn't good enough, or that they should raise him instead. Again, Oliver said no. Then Kirsten mentioned Orla and asked how she acted as his teacher. Oliver described how Orla helped everyone in class equally, how she was nice, but not in a way that made him feel special or different from the other kids. Kirsten explained that this was what appropriate care looked like, people showing they cared through consistent actions without trying to make him feel like he belonged only to them. 4 months after I first filed the complaint, I got a letter from the State Teaching Certification Board. They'd completed their investigation into Miss Whitman's conduct. The board decided to suspend her teaching license for 2 years and required her to complete professional ethics training and undergo a psychological evaluation before she could even apply to get her license back. I read the letter 3 times trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me felt relieved that the state took it seriously enough to actually suspend her license, but another part of me felt angry that 2 years seemed way too short for what she'd done to our kids. I called the attorney Robert Adler and asked if this was normal. He explained that without criminal charges, this was actually a pretty serious professional consequence. The suspension would be on her record permanently, and any future employer who checked would see it. Most school districts wouldn't hire someone with a boundary violation suspension on their record. Robert said 2 years might not feel like enough, but it would likely end her teaching career for good. Mrs. Foster called me in for a meeting about the new policies the district was putting in place. She'd worked with the superintendent and the district lawyer to create rules that would prevent another situation like ours. Every teacher would now get regular observation visits from administrators, not just the scheduled ones they knew about in advance. All staff had to complete training on professional boundaries every year. Parents would have a clear way to report concerns without worrying that the principal would brush them off. Mrs. Foster looked tired as she explained all this, like she'd aged 5 years in the past few months. She asked me, Catherine, Madeline, and Vicky to meet with her as a group to review the changes and tell her if we thought anything was missing. We sat in her office going through the new policy manual page by page. Most of it looked good, but I kept thinking about how Miss Whitman had problems at her previous school that nobody told us about. I brought up the issue of teachers transferring between districts. I explained that Miss Whitman's previous school had reprimanded her for boundary issues, but gave her a neutral reference letter anyway, because they wanted to avoid legal problems. If the new district had known about those red flags, maybe they wouldn't have hired her and our kids wouldn't have gone through this. Mrs. Foster nodded slowly and said she'd never thought about that angle. Owen Grimes was sitting in on the meeting, and he pulled out his phone to make notes. He said this was a real problem in education, that districts often gave problem teachers good references just to move them along to somewhere else. Owen promised to work with the district's lawyer to figure out new rules for reference checks and sharing information about past problems. He said it wouldn't be easy because of privacy laws and fear of lawsuits, but after what happened with Miss Whitman, the district had to find a way to do better. I suggest the district needs better communication between schools when teachers transfer, so red flags from previous positions don't get lost in neutral reference letters. Owen takes this seriously and works with the district's lawyer to develop new protocols for reference checks and information sharing. 2 weeks later, Oliver bounced through the front door with his backpack dragging behind him and dropped it on the floor with a thud. He started talking before I could even say hello, words tumbling out about how Orla let them do a science experiment with vinegar and baking soda to make volcanoes. He described every detail, how the foam erupted over the sides of the cup, how his friend Ethan got some on his shirt, how Orla said they could do more experiments next week if everyone cleaned up properly. He talked about playing soccer at recess and how he scored a goal, and then about the story Orla read during quiet time, something about a kid who found a magic treehouse. I stood in the kitchen listening to him ramble on about normal first-grade things, friends and learning and games, without a single mention of teachers being like parents or needing special care. My throat got tight, and I had to turn away to wipe my eyes because this was what 6-year-olds were supposed to sound like when they came home from the school. Just excited about volcanoes and soccer and stories, nothing complicated or confusing, just a regular good day. Oliver grabbed a snack and kept chattering while I made dinner, and I realized I hadn't heard him sound this genuinely happy about school since the first few weeks with Miss Whitman, before everything got weird. The next afternoon, I sat in Kirsten's office for our regular check-in about Oliver's progress. She had her notes spread out on the desk and looked up at me with a small smile. She explained that Oliver had reached a point where he didn't need weekly therapy anymore, that he'd developed good strategies for handling confusing feelings about adults and their behavior. She said he was rebuilding his ability to trust teachers within normal boundaries, understanding that they could be kind without trying to replace me or take over his life. She recommended moving to sessions every other week for the next few months, then maybe once a month after that if he continued doing well. I asked if this meant he was really okay now, if the damage from Miss Whitman was actually healing, and Kirsten explained that kids are pretty tough when they get the right support early. Oliver had processed what happened in an age-appropriate way, understanding that Miss Whitman made mistakes without carrying around heavy trauma about it. He might be more cautious with teachers than other kids his age, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, just a learned awareness of appropriate boundaries. Kirsten said I'd done exactly the right things by taking his concerns seriously, getting him help quickly, and maintaining consistent reassurance that none of it was his fault. 3 weeks after that, I walked into the school for a parent-teacher conference with Orla. I sat in one of those tiny chairs meant for first graders, while Orla pulled out Oliver's work samples and assessment scores. She told me Oliver was bright and engaged, always participating in class discussions and helping other students when they got stuck on assignments. She showed me his reading progress, his math worksheets, his drawings and writing samples, all of it showing a kid who was learning and growing exactly like he should be. Then she mentioned that Oliver still sometimes asked her in the morning if she was definitely coming back tomorrow, needing that reassurance that she wouldn't disappear like Miss Whitman did. But overall, he was doing great academically and socially, making friends, following classroom rules, showing enthusiasm for learning. Orla said she could see how much progress he'd made since she took over the class in January, how he'd gone from anxious and withdrawn to confident and happy. She credited the therapy and my consistent support at home, but I could tell she'd also worked hard to create a safe classroom environment where Oliver could relax and just be a student. I thanked her for understanding what Oliver needed and for giving him the space to heal while still challenging him academically. That evening, my phone rang and Catherine's name showed up on the screen. I answered, and she immediately started talking about how much better Sophie was doing lately, how she'd stopped asking if Miss Whitman could be her mom and had started talking about her actual parents in normal ways again. Catherine said she was so grateful we'd found each other through this whole mess that having other parents who understood what our kids went through made everything easier. She suggested we should get our families together regularly, maybe monthly dinners or weekend park trips, because Sophie and Oliver had formed this bond through their shared experience, even though they couldn't quite explain what they had in common. I agreed it was a good idea, that Oliver could use more friends who got what he'd been through without needing all the details explained. We picked a date for the following Saturday and talked about maybe including Madeline and Vicky's families too, creating a little support network for the kids and parents who'd all been affected by Miss Whitman's behavior. After I hung up, I sat on the couch thinking about how focused I'd been on Oliver's healing for the past 6 months. Every decision, every conversation, every therapy session had been about making sure he was okay, that he understood what happened, that he could move forward without being damaged by Miss Whitman's manipulation. But I hadn't really dealt with my own feelings about the whole thing. The anger at someone who exploited my son's grief over losing his mother. The fear that I'd missed warning signs that should have been obvious. The guilt over letting it go on for so long before I took action. I'd pushed all of that aside to focus on Oliver. But now that he was doing better, I could feel everything I'd been ignoring starting to bubble up. I found myself getting unreasonably angry at small things, snapping at people at work, lying awake at night replaying every interaction with Miss Whitman, and beating myself up for not seeing through her act sooner. I realized I probably needed to talk to someone about this too, that I couldn't just pretend I was fine when I clearly wasn't processing what had happened to our family. I called Kirsten's office the next day and asked if she could recommend a therapist for adults dealing with the aftermath of what happened with Miss Whitman. She gave me 2 names and I scheduled an appointment with the first one for the following week. Sitting in that therapist's office felt weird at first, being the one in the chair instead of the parent waiting outside while my kid got help. But once I started talking about the guilt and the anger and the fear, it all came pouring out in ways I hadn't expected. The therapist listened and then started helping me understand that Miss Whitman's manipulation wasn't just aimed at the kids. It was designed to make parents like me feel grateful for her attention instead of suspicious of it. She deliberately played on my insecurities as a single parent, making comments about being overwhelmed and needing help, framing her boundary violations as generous concern instead of inappropriate intrusion. The therapist explained that I was also a victim of her manipulation, not just a negligent parent who should have known better. Recognizing that helped me start to forgive myself for not seeing through her act immediately, understanding that she'd been sophisticated and deliberate in how she operated. The school year crawled toward its end, and Oliver completed 1st grade with Orla as his teacher. On the last day of school, they had an end-of-year celebration with cookies and juice boxes and presentations of student work. Oliver walked up to Orla with a card he'd made, construction paper folded in half with crayon drawings on the front. He handed it to her and she opened it and read whatever he'd written inside, then smiled and thanked him. Later when we got home, I asked what the card said, and Oliver told me he'd thanked her for being a good teacher. Just that simple phrase, good teacher, not best teacher or favorite teacher or anything about being like family. Just good teacher, acknowledging that she'd done her job well within appropriate boundaries. That simplicity showed me how far he'd come in understanding what healthy teacher-student relationships looked like, that teachers could be kind and supportive without trying to become substitute parents or demanding special emotional attachment. Summer break started, and suddenly Oliver had 2 months without the daily reminder of school and teachers and complicated adult relationships. We went on a camping trip to a state park 3 hours away, sleeping in a tent and cooking hot dogs over a fire and hiking trails through the woods. Oliver ran around catching bugs and climbing trees and swimming in the lake, just being a kid without any weight on his shoulders. We spent lazy days at the community pool where he played with other kids and practiced his swimming while I sat on a lounge chair reading and watching him. I could see the difference in how he moved through the world now, more relaxed and confident, laughing freely without that shadow of confusion and misplaced attachment that had haunted him for months. He was just a regular 7-year-old having a regular summer, and that felt like the biggest victory of all. In late July, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman introduced herself as a parent from a different elementary school in another district about 20 miles away. She explained that Miss Whitman had applied for a teaching position at their school, and someone on the hiring committee had found news coverage of the investigation into her conduct. The committee wanted to hear directly from an affected parent before making their decision about whether to interview her. My stomach dropped at the thought of Miss Whitman trying to get back into a classroom, but I told the woman I'd be happy to share our experience. She thanked me and said she had about an hour if I was available to talk right then. I spent the next hour giving her a detailed account of everything that happened, starting with the small boundary violations and building up to Miss Whitman telling Oliver she wanted to be his mom. I explained how she'd targeted kids from single-parent homes, particularly those who'd lost a parent through death or divorce, and how she'd systematically tried to position herself as a better alternative to their actual families. I described the emotional impact on Oliver, the months of therapy he'd needed, the fear and confusion he'd experienced. I told her about the other families affected, about the investigation findings, about the suspension of Miss Whitman's teaching license. The woman on the phone stayed quiet through most of it, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and when I finished, she thanked me for being so thorough and honest. She said the hiring committee would definitely not be moving forward with Miss Whitman's application, and that she was grateful someone had thought to reach out to affected families before making that mistake. After I hung up, I felt this sense of purpose, knowing that sharing our story might protect other children from going through what Oliver experienced, that something good could come from our painful situation. A week after that phone call, I got a text from Catherine asking if I wanted to meet for coffee with her, Madeline, and Vicky. We'd been in touch here and there over the summer, quick messages checking in on how our kids were doing, but we hadn't all gotten together since the investigation wrapped up. I agreed, and we met at a cafe downtown on a Saturday morning while our kids were at various activities. We sat at a corner table with our drinks and started talking about normal parent stuff, swim lessons and soccer camp and vacation plans, and it felt strange at first because we'd only ever talked about the crisis that brought us together. Catherine mentioned that Sophie had made a new friend at day camp who she played with every day. Madeline said her son was learning to ride a bike without training wheels. Vicky showed us photos of her daughter's art project, a painting of their family that included their dog. We were just parents sharing the small joys and challenges of raising kids, not a support group bonded by trauma. About an hour into the conversation, Vicky said something that made us all pause. She said she was grateful we'd found each other, even though she wished it had been under different circumstances, and we all nodded because that captured exactly how we felt. We'd become real friends through the worst experience of our parenting lives, and now we were building something beyond that shared pain. We made plans to get our kids together for a play date at the park the following weekend. And as we left the cafe, I realized these friendships would last because they were based on genuine connection and mutual support, not just the crisis that initially brought us together. Oliver started asking about second grade a few days later while we were eating dinner. He wanted to know who his teacher would be, and if she would be nice and if she would like him. I could hear the worry in his voice, that tight quality that meant he was anxious about something but trying not to show it. I put down my fork and looked at him across the table. I told him we wouldn't know who his teacher was until right before school started, but that every teacher was different and that was okay. Some teachers were quiet and some were energetic, some were strict about rules and some were more relaxed, and none of that made them good or bad, just different. I said it was okay to take time to get to know a new teacher before deciding how he felt about them, that he didn't have to love his teacher right away or think they were the best teacher ever. He could just see what they were like and how he felt in their classroom, and that was enough. Oliver seemed to relax a little at that, like I'd given him permission to be cautious instead of immediately trusting and attaching to whoever his new teacher turned out to be. He asked if his second grade teacher would bring him special lunches or want to take him places on weekends. I said no, that teachers weren't supposed to do those things, and his new teacher would treat him the same way she treated all the other students, which was exactly what he needed. 2 weeks before school started, I scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Foster to talk about Oliver's placement in second grade. I sat in her office, the same place where I'd first demanded she investigate Miss Whitman almost a year ago, and this time the conversation was completely different. She told me she'd been very careful about selecting Oliver's teacher for second grade, looking for someone who was structured and consistent and had experience with students who needed extra emotional support. She'd chosen a teacher named Fiorella Marks, who had been teaching second grade for 8 years and had a reputation for being kind, but maintaining clear boundaries with her students. Mrs. Foster said she would brief Fiorella on Oliver's history with Miss Whitman without making him feel labeled or different from the other kids. She'd explain that Oliver needed consistency and appropriate distance, that he might be cautious about trusting his teacher at first, and that this was normal and healthy given what he'd been through. I asked if Fiorella knew about the investigation, and Mrs. Foster said yes, that all the teachers in the building had been informed about what happened and had received training on professional boundaries as a result. I left her office feeling cautiously hopeful that second grade would be a fresh start for Oliver, a chance to experience what a normal teacher-student relationship looked like. The Back to the School open house happened on a Thursday evening in late August. Oliver held my hand tightly as we walked through the hallways looking for his new classroom. We found it and went inside, and Fiorella was standing by her desk greeting families as they arrived. She was probably in her mid-30s with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and glasses, wearing jeans and a school t-shirt. She smiled when she saw us and introduced herself, shaking my hand and then crouching down to Oliver's level to say hello. She asked him a few questions about what he liked to do for fun and what his favorite subject was, the same questions she was asking every kid who came through the door. She didn't single him out or give him extra attention or try to create some special connection. She was friendly, but not overly enthusiastic, treating Oliver exactly like every other student in the class, and I could see him starting to relax as he realized she wasn't going to be like Miss Whitman. We looked around the classroom at the decorated bulletin boards and the reading corner and the desks arranged in groups of 4. Fiorella explained her classroom rules and her homework policy and how she communicated with parents, all very straightforward and professional. When we left, Oliver said she seemed okay, not amazing or the best or his favorite, just okay, and that simple assessment was exactly what I'd hoped for. The first week of second grade went smoothly, in ways that felt almost boring after the drama of first grade. Oliver came home each day with normal stories about what they'd learned in math and who he played with at recess, and a funny thing that happened at lunch when someone spilled their milk. He talked about Fiorella the way kids talk about teachers, mentioning things she said or rules she had, but without the intense attachment and constant references that had marked his relationship with Miss Whitman. On Friday, I asked him how he liked his new teacher, and he shrugged and said she was fine, she was nice, she helped him when he didn't understand something. It was such a normal, healthy response that I almost wanted to cry with relief. We'd finally reached a place where school was just school again, not a source of anxiety and confusion and complicated emotions. Oliver was learning and playing and making friends, and his teacher was just his teacher, not someone trying to insert herself into our family or replace his dead mother. The ordinariness of it all felt like the biggest victory we'd achieved in the entire year since Miss Whitman first started crossing boundaries. I had a final consultation with Kirsten on a Tuesday afternoon while Oliver was at the school. I sat in her office where we'd had so many conversations about his healing process, and she told me that Oliver had successfully processed his experience with Miss Whitman. He developed an age-appropriate understanding of boundaries and what healthy teacher-student relationships looked like. He knew that teachers should be kind and helpful, but not try to act like parents, that they should treat all students fairly without singling anyone out for special attention, that they shouldn't tell students they love them or want to be their mom or dad. Kirsten said Oliver had done the work of integrating this confusing experience into his understanding of the world without being traumatized by it, which was the best outcome we could have hoped for. She recommended we end our regular therapy sessions, but keep her as a resource if any issues came up in the future. If Oliver started showing signs of anxiety about teachers or authority figures, if he had trouble trusting adults, if anything triggered memories of what happened with Miss Whitman, I could call her and we'd schedule appointments as needed. But for now, Oliver was healthy and resilient and ready to move forward. I thanked her for everything she'd done to help my son heal, and I left her office feeling grateful that we'd had access to someone who understood childhood trauma and knew how to guide kids through it. The district held a parent meeting in September, where Owen Grimes presented the new policies and procedures they'd implemented in response to our case. I sat in the school auditorium with about 200 other parents and listened as he explained the changes. All teachers would now receive annual training on professional boundaries and appropriate relationships with students. Principals would conduct more frequent classroom observations, looking specifically for boundary violations. The district had created a clear reporting system for parents to raise concerns without fear that their complaints would be dismissed. They'd changed their reference check procedures to include direct conversations with previous employers instead of just accepting written references. Owen acknowledged that the system had failed to protect our children and that these changes were designed to make sure it didn't happen again. After the presentation, several parents came up to me privately to thank me for speaking up and making the schools safer for all children. One mom said her daughter had mentioned that her teacher sometimes said things that made her uncomfortable, and now she felt like she could report it and be taken seriously. Another dad said he'd been worried about seeming overprotective if he questioned his son's teacher's behavior, but now he knew the district would listen. I felt proud that something good had come from our painful experience, that Oliver's suffering had led to changes that might protect other kids from similar situations. Oliver and I were sitting at the kitchen table one evening doing homework when he said something that caught me off guard. He told me he understood now that Miss Whitman was confused about how to be a good teacher. It was such a simple, childlike way of explaining what had happened, reducing her manipulation and boundary violations to confusion rather than malice or mental illness. But it showed me that he'd integrated the experience into his understanding of the world in a way that made sense to him. He wasn't traumatized or angry or scared. He'd processed what happened and come to a conclusion that let him move forward without carrying emotional damage. I asked him what he meant by confused, and he said that teachers are supposed to help kids learn and be nice to them, but they're not supposed to try to be their mom or dad, and Miss Whitman didn't understand that difference. He said Fiorella understood it because she was nice, but she didn't try to be his mom. She was just his teacher. I told him he was exactly right, and that I was proud of how he'd figured all this out. I silently thanked Kirsten for her skilled guidance in helping him reach this point of understanding without bitterness or fear. I was checking my email one Saturday morning when I saw a message from the state certification board. My stomach tightened as I opened it, wondering what they wanted almost 2 years after Miss Whitman's license had been suspended. The email informed me that Miss Whitman had applied for early reinstatement of her teaching license and asked if I wanted to submit a statement opposing it. She'd only been suspended for 2 years and was trying to get her license back after serving just half that time. I sat at my computer for a long time thinking about what to write. Part of me wanted to be angry and vengeful, to write a statement full of rage about what she'd done to Oliver and the other kids, but I knew that wouldn't be effective or appropriate. I needed to write something measured and factual that explained why 2 years wasn't sufficient time to ensure she wouldn't repeat her pattern with other vulnerable children. I spent the next hour writing a response that laid out the specific boundary violations she'd committed, the emotional impact on the affected students, and my concerns about her applying for reinstatement so quickly. I explained that while I hoped she'd gotten help for whatever drove her behavior, I didn't believe 18 months was enough time to address the deep issues that led her to target grieving and divorced children and try to insert herself into their families. I said the certification board should require her to complete the full 2-year suspension and demonstrate through therapy records and professional evaluations that she'd genuinely changed before allowing her back into a classroom. I submitted the statement and hoped the board would take it seriously. 3 weeks later, I received another email from the certification board. They'd denied Miss Whitman's early reinstatement request, and she would need to serve her full 2-year suspension before she could apply again. When she did apply for reinstatement, she would need to provide documentation of completed therapy, undergo a psychological evaluation, and demonstrate understanding of professional boundaries through additional ethics training. The board's decision gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. The system had initially failed us when Mrs. Foster dismissed my concerns and when the hiring process didn't catch Miss Whitman's previous boundary violations. But ultimately, the system had taken the situation seriously and prioritized children's safety over a teacher's career convenience. Miss Whitman wouldn't be able to walk into another classroom and do to other kids what she'd done to Oliver, at least not for another year, and not without proving she'd changed. I closed my laptop and went to find Oliver, who was playing in the backyard with a neighbor kid, laughing and running and being a normal 7-year-old without any weight on his shoulders. 3 weeks after the certification board's decision, Mrs. Foster called to ask if Catherine and I would speak at a parent education night the district was organizing. She explained they wanted to help other parents recognize warning signs of inappropriate teacher behavior before situations escalated like ours had. Catherine and I met at the coffee shop to prepare what we'd say, and we decided to focus on the specific red flags we'd missed or dismissed. We wouldn't name Miss Whitman or give details that would identify our kids, just share the general patterns that other parents might encounter. The night of the presentation, about 40 parents filled the school library, and I felt my stomach twist as I looked at all those faces waiting to hear our story. Catherine spoke first, describing how her daughter had come home with comments about divorce, meaning parents didn't love enough, and how she'd initially thought it was just a child misunderstanding adult conversations. She explained how the comments became more frequent and specific, how the teacher started bringing special treats just for her daughter, how the attention felt flattering at first before it started feeling wrong. I talked about Oliver's experience without using his name, explaining how grief over losing his mother had made him vulnerable to someone offering excessive care and attention. I described the lunch replacements, the costume incident, the offers to take him places outside school, and how each thing seemed small by itself, but formed a pattern when we looked back. Several parents nodded as I spoke, and one mother raised her hand to ask how we'd known when to take action versus when to give the teacher the benefit of the doubt. Catherine answered that one, saying we'd learned to trust our instincts when something felt off, even if we couldn't immediately explain why it bothered us. After the presentation, parents came up to thank us and ask questions, and 3 different people mentioned they'd noticed small things with their kids' teachers that they'd been dismissing as overthinking. We encouraged them to document anything that concerned them and to talk to other parents to see if patterns emerged. Driving home that night, I felt like maybe the awful experience with Miss Whitman could prevent other families from going through what we had. Oliver's 2nd grade year moved along without any problems that made my stomach drop or my mind race with worry. He'd come home talking about math problems and playground games, and a kid named Ethan who collected rocks, all the normal stuff 7-year-olds cared about. His friendship group had expanded to include 4 or 5 regular playmates, and I'd started getting invited to weekend birthday parties at trampoline parks and pizza places. Fiorella sent home weekly progress reports that showed Oliver reading above grade level and participating actively in class discussions, and at our fall conference she told me he was a joy to teach. She mentioned that he sometimes asked for extra reassurance about classroom routines and whether she'd be there the next day, but she understood why, and gave him the consistency he needed without making him feel different from other kids. I watched him do his homework at the kitchen table one evening, his tongue sticking out slightly as he concentrated on writing sentences about his favorite animal, and realized I wasn't constantly analyzing every teacher interaction or watching for signs of inappropriate attention. When Fiorella gave the class a group reward of extra recess time, Oliver came home excited about playing longer, not worried about what the reward meant or whether it came with strings attached. His relationship with his teacher was exactly what it should be, built on respect and appropriate boundaries, and I could see him thriving in that healthy environment. Parent pickup became a normal routine again, instead of a chance to interrogate Oliver about his day and scan for warning signs. He'd run out of school with his backpack bouncing, tell me 1 or 2 highlights from the day, and then we'd go home and move on with our evening. The hypervigilance that had consumed me during the crisis with Miss Whitman had faded into normal parental awareness, the kind where I paid attention but didn't obsess over every detail. I found myself sitting in the bleachers at Oliver's soccer practice one Saturday morning, chatting with other parents about normal things like weekend plans and whether the kids needed new cleats yet, and realized I'd stopped second-guessing every adult interaction in his life. When his coach praised his improvement at dribbling, I didn't wonder if the attention was appropriate or if there was some hidden agenda behind the compliment. When the team mom organized a pizza party after their last game, I didn't worry about who would be supervising or whether Oliver would be singled out for special treatment. The constant mental checklist I'd been running through every interaction had quietly disappeared, replaced by the normal awareness that any parent has about their kids' activities and relationships. At the school, when Fiorella asked if I could volunteer for the fall festival, I said yes without spending 3 days analyzing whether it was appropriate or what her motivations might be. I helped run the ring toss booth alongside other parents, and when Fiorella stopped by to thank the volunteers, I had a brief, pleasant conversation with her about how well Oliver was doing, without my mind racing through every word looking for hidden meanings. The fear and suspicion that had colored every interaction with teachers and school staff had faded, and I could engage with Oliver's education the way I had before Miss Whitman, trusting that most people who work with kids genuinely care about them in appropriate ways. I still paid attention and stayed involved, but I wasn't constantly watching for warning signs or preparing for the next crisis. Oliver asked me one evening why I seemed happier lately, and I realized he'd been picking up on the shift in my energy, even though I hadn't consciously noticed it myself. I told him I was happy because he was doing so well in the school, and making good friends, which was true. But the deeper truth was that I'd finally let go of the fear that had been driving me since we'd gone through the situation with Miss Whitman. On the anniversary of the day I'd first reported Miss Whitman to Mrs. Foster, I took Oliver out for ice cream after school without telling him why. We sat at a small table with our cones, his chocolate chip and mine mint, and I asked him if he remembered when he'd had a different first-grade teacher before Orla. He nodded and said he remembered Miss Whitman had left and Orla had come, but he didn't remember exactly when or why. I told him we'd gone through something hard together that year, something that had been confusing and scary for both of us, but we'd gotten through it and come out stronger on the other side. He asked if it was about Miss Whitman saying weird things about being his mom, and I was surprised he remembered that specifically when so much else had faded. I said yes, that was part of it, and explained that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about how to treat kids, and when that happens, other grown-ups have to step in and fix it. He seemed satisfied with that explanation and went back to eating his ice cream, telling me about a science experiment Fiorella was planning for next week involving volcanoes. The fact that he could mention his current teacher in the same conversation where we'd talked about Miss Whitman without any anxiety or confusion showed me how far he'd come in processing what had happened. He didn't need to understand the full timeline or all the details of what we'd gone through. He just needed to know that we'd faced something difficult together and made it through, and that was enough understanding for a 7-year-old. We finished our ice cream and walked back to the car, and Oliver asked if we could stop at the park on the way home. I said yes, and watched him run toward the swings, a normal kid having a normal day, and felt grateful that the crisis with Miss Whitman hadn't broken either of us. My phone rang 3 days later while I was making dinner, and Catherine's name appeared on the screen. She told me she'd just gotten off a call with Mrs. Foster, who had some news she thought we'd want to hear. The district had developed a comprehensive training program on professional boundaries and appropriate teacher-student relationships, and they were naming it the Parent Advocacy Initiative in honor of our group of families who'd spoken up about Miss Whitman. Mrs. Foster wanted to know if we'd be willing to help train new teachers by sharing our experience and the warning signs we'd learned to recognize. Catherine said she'd already agreed and wanted to know if I was in too, and I said yes, without hesitation. Turning our painful experience into education for others felt like a way to honor what our children had gone through and make sure it meant something beyond just our own family's healing. We'd be meeting with the district's professional development coordinator next week to plan the training curriculum, and Mrs. Foster wanted us involved in developing the actual content rather than just showing up to tell our story. I hung up and stood at the stove stirring pasta sauce, thinking about how strange it was that something so awful had led to this opportunity to maybe prevent other families from going through what we had. Oliver came into the kitchen asking what was for dinner, and I told him spaghetti, his favorite. He started setting the table without being asked, chatting about his day, and I watched him move around the kitchen with the easy confidence of a kid who felt safe and secure in his world. The district naming their program after our advocacy felt like validation that speaking up had been the right choice, even when it had been terrifying and exhausting and full of self-doubt. Catherine called back later that evening after Oliver was in bed, and we talked for an hour about what we wanted to include in the training. We agreed that the focus should be on empowering parents to trust their instincts and providing concrete examples of boundary violations so teachers would understand where the lines were. We wanted to make sure new teachers learned these lessons without having to make the mistakes Miss Whitman had made, and that parents knew they had the right to question things that felt wrong without being dismissed as overprotective or difficult. Oliver and I settled into our normal life with school and homework and weekend activities, the comfortable routine of a family that had healed from something hard. Saturday mornings meant soccer practice. Sunday afternoons often included playdates with Ethan or one of Oliver's other friends, and weekday evenings followed the predictable pattern of dinner, homework, bath time, and bedtime stories. We'd started a tradition of Friday movie nights where Oliver got to pick what we watched, and we made popcorn together, and those quiet evenings on the couch became my favorite part of the week. He was doing well in the school, bringing home spelling tests with gold stars and math worksheets he'd completed carefully, and Fiorella's notes in his folder were consistently positive. When other parents asked me how things were going, I could honestly say great without the qualifier of considering what we went through that had colored my responses for so long. We were more careful now about trusting too quickly. Both of us and I noticed Oliver took longer to warm up to new adults in his life than he had before Miss Whitman. But we weren't broken or bitter, just wiser and more aware of how things could go wrong when boundaries weren't maintained. I'd learned to trust my instincts instead of dismissing concerns as overreaction, and Oliver had learned that it was okay to feel uncomfortable with adult behavior and tell me about it. The hardest parenting challenge I'd faced since losing my wife had taught me that protecting Oliver sometimes meant making waves and refusing to accept dismissive responses from people in authority. I looked at my son playing in the backyard one Sunday afternoon, building an elaborate fort out of cardboard boxes, and felt proud of both of us for getting through the crisis with Miss Whitman and coming out stronger on the other side.